Okay.
Okay. Thank you so much for everybody for coming to this day 2 of Global Fable sessions. So we are starting with the panel called Continuity and Circulation of Fables in the Circum-Mediterranean, chaired by Dr. Christoph Lange, University of Cologne, and Mesh. But before doing that, we are delighted to welcome Beatrice Gründler. She's a German Arabianist and the professor of the Arabic language and literature at Free University of Berlin. And she is the PI of a fantastic project called Kalīla and Dimna AnonymClassic, Arabic Literature Cosmopolitan. So I think like she has to run, so but she can. So like we have like 10 minutes or so from her. So please, Beatrice.
Great. Thank you, Kaori, for inviting me. And let me share my PowerPoint and I'll tell you a little bit. And I have no problem with you interrupting me. Should there be anything that is not clear? Not a problem at all. Can you all see my PowerPoint?
Yes.
Great. So Kalīla and Dimna, AnonymClassic, and Arabic Literature Cosmopolitan are two phases really of the same project. And why is Kalīla or Dimna interesting? It is a first in several ways within Arabic literature. Is quite a remarkable book. These are the points I will be talking about. After that, I'll talk about the transformations, because it is a book that is very hard to grasp. It is not stable. And the kind of its transformations is what has kept us busy over the last 6 years. And we have sort of found 4 impulses that affect the transformations and transmissions of the work, which is indirect transition, continua, cross-copying, and print. I'll give you some glimpses of each. And then the difference in these changes themselves is also unpredictable. It's quite an unpredictable work. But coming to the firsts of Kalīla, it is the first Arabic book of fictional prose and a rather large book, 15 chapters. And its genre doesn't have a fixed place in the system of Arabic literary genres. It gets combined with many different types of genres in manuscripts. And my postdoc and now Professor Matt Keegan has called this generic indeterminacy and written an article about that in Poetica. And it is also a book that has 2 layers. It has an explicit, entertaining layer of storytelling, but it has an implicit, to be decoded inner meaning that can be ethical, philosophical, or else. And the book itself explains that in one of the prefaces. It is a global book. Here you can see its history of dissemination. Chronologically, the thick arrows begin, of course, in India. That is the parts of the book which get assembled in Middle Persian Pahlavi. That version is lost, survives in its 2 translations, Older Syriac, 6th century, and Arabic. And from Arabic, which is the middle here, then all further extant versions today derive. Obviously, the Mahabharata and the Panchatantra, which supply some of the chapters, survive independently, but these are different works. Kalīla only takes some of their chapters. This is a historical view of the same thing what I showed you all above there, the Indian works, which each give elements to Kalīla or Dimna, the lost Middle Persian version. There is a Tibetan branch, and then the Older Syriac and the Arabic version. The Older Syriac is preserved, and that is very helpful as a double-check way to know what was the Vorlage, roughly, very not word by word, but in its construction, in its layout of what the Arabic translator adapter had before him, although he added more chapters. This is what happens after Arabic, and I will not go in all. This also, we stop here at the 14th century, so otherwise it would have been many, many more languages. They're over 50, no, they're over 40, and they extend from Iceland in the northwest to the Southeast Asian languages. But the ones that are important are the ones that antedate the Arabic manuscripts, or are as old as the Arabic manuscripts, and those translations are very close to the early version of the tale. For instance, you see here the lower right, the Old Castilian translations, almost verbatim of one of our manuscripts, whereas the Greek translation is rather free, and the Persian translation is very creative because it fills the texts with new elements, with Arabic poetry, with Persian poetry, with stories. So that by itself is a work of art. So Kalīla was a kind of text that could spur on new creativity. It precedes the rise of books in the 9th century CE, and itself reflects about what a book is. And as a fable collection, its animals are not typecast. So the animals have many different character traits. A jackal can be virtuous, it can be very devious, can be very passive. One chapter may have a mouse, a deer, a turtle, a dove, and they're all best friends. And they are also humans. Some chapters even only have humans. So one has to extend the concept of what a fable is if one wants to engage with Kalīla. These are very early examples from the Cairo Geniza that shows you we have a illustrated book, probably as of the 10th century, a popular book. Then it was imported from Persia, with the people doing so being aware that this is a very valuable kind of knowledge. It's a knowledge to rule. So it's animals, but it's political and diplomatic, important knowledge for rulers. This is the story of its import. It's one of the prefaces of the physician Bolshoi, it's a legendary character, going to the king of India and stealing the book. Here he's allowed to read it, but not copy it, and he memorizes it and brings it back home. So there are many, many variations of this event. Now, what happens to the book? Mouvance. We called it a written mouvance, taking the term from Paul Zumthor, who coined it for medieval French literature. So quotation is the first because we have no manuscript for 500 years. This is a bad image of a miscellany that on the upper right has some quotations of Kalīla or Dimna. In this case, the quotations are selected in a rather well thought out fashion around thematic clusters that have to do with ruling. So how to send spies, how to deal with enemies, and so on and so forth. We just still analyzing, we just discovered that that's part of the same book. It is attributed to the Caliph Al-Ma'mun, who died 833, but of course that is not to be believed. He is just, he spearheaded the translation movement in the Abbasid dynasty, therefore he's a kind of person to attribute this to. Then the interesting thing is the continuum is a concept we have discovered or coined for our editions. I'll show you how that looks. It is a very gradual way of the text to change that you can trace if you digitize many different manuscripts, cut them into small pieces, and then see across several manuscripts that one has then to select representatively how the text develops very slowly. And that looks like this. This is a page of our online edition, only one chapter, one section on the upper right. We always summarize what happens in that section here. The rat points out their common problem. This is the rat and the cat, two enemies who collaborate because they themselves are surrounded by more enemies, and they both survive because they're smart enough to temporarily suspend their enmity, and then they part after that. So that's one of the chapters. And this is a zoom in. The link is open. All this edition is available online at our website. You can play around with it. There is one that has an English translation. So you see, there is text on that segment, but even by the length of the text, you can say it grows and shrinks. And later on, I show you an algorithm that actually identifies same passages when we get to my last chapter. Another phenomenon that happened is cross-copying, and we noticed that some chapters, some copyists noticing, they were just as smart as we are, that there are many strongly different versions. And some did the extra mile and said, okay, we combine a number and optimize the text. And in one, it's done in a big box fashion. This is where the preface is combined from two different versions. So this copyist of an 18th century manuscript has on the lower right is the title of the introduction of the Arabic translator adapter, Al-Bab al-Awwal fi Tarjamat Abdullah ibn al-Muqaffa. So first chapter. Then comes another preface. A couple of pages later, the chapter comes again, called a little bit differently, Bab Gharad al-Kitab. So the purpose of the book, because that chapter is a bit the mode of instructions how to read it. So here is from a different Vorlage. So the copies wanted to have both versions. And sometimes it happens in a very small-grained way. Now, don't get scared. You'll get a diagram. That's not the story. This is if you take our edition and represent the text of each segment that I showed you before as little box. So now one manuscript goes from left to right. And if you read them on the left here where my cursor is, you get the name of all the manuscripts. And then you see what text passage is present in each. In this part of chapter, the main story tends to overlap quite a bit. But in that chapter, since the issue is an unjust king punishing an innocent courtier, and then how that happens, what goes on from there, you can see the copyists interfering in the text. And this is why in the second on the right side, many of the text parts appear in very few versions. And now you see there is one line that has more blocks than others. Here I made it orange. So this manuscript, the Paris manuscript, can be discovered or can be seen to have taken text from other widely different versions. And there are some manuscripts that do that more intensely. Another chapter, a similar case happens. This is another chapter. This is Dimna's trial. And this chapter has been added by the Arabic translator, adapter Ibn Muqaffa. It's very political. So the bottom line, again, has more units. And here I made it orange. And you can see again that from very different versions up here, from the upper half, from the lower half, the bottom adds it up and wants to have, the maximized amount of text. This is cross-copying. In medieval studies, sometimes they call that contamination. We don't like that word. Then when Sylvestre de Sacy, the earliest professor in Paris, makes a printed edition, this is the one on the left, Kitab Kalīla and Dimna, Antoine Sylvestre de Sacy, 1816. That, again, is recopied many times in manuscripts. And we have 11 manuscripts, and that leads to a kind of stabilization because of the prestigious nature of this version. And that, in a way, reigns in the variety of the rewriting. Now, to complicate matters further, the way chapters differ from each other also differs. I show you that. And here, not only did we take our little box representation, but we also wanted a more objective way. So we ran the boxes through an Euclidean algorithm and then turned that into dendrograms. And the arches show low arches, high proximity, high arches, low proximity. All the addition, by the way, and even including this algorithm, has been done by Mahmoud Koza, who is my digital humanities expert, in collaboration with Marwa Ahmed. Both of those are responsible. So here you see a bifurcation. So here two groups of two continua within themselves are somewhat more cohesive than between themselves. That's one way of difference in a chapter. And this is, so the subtail, for instance, is only in one group, and the others lack those three subtails. Is a thief confusing a jar of gold coins with a jar of grains? Very upsetting. This is now another chapter. This is the voyage of the physician Bourzois I had showed you before. And again, you have sort of two groups and one middle three manuscripts that are on the way between the one and the other. And the interesting part is the group with the gray box. Gray boxes mean they have been moved in their position from another place. And the gray box group is the one that gives an additional scene to the physician Bourzois to give a public speech before about his dangerous mission to India. So this version makes a hero out of the scholar and brings out the adventurous and the valid nature of such scholarship. This is yet another chapter with, I showed you that before, we skipped that. And now I come to a chapter that is the wildest that I last dealt with. I'm still not completely through understanding what happens. It's the chapter of Dimna's trial. The smart, eloquent, yet devious character Dimna, who causes the lion to kill the ox. And this is his trial, which is justified since Dimna caused the lion to commit a murder, yet he is not the murderer. And it's a really a rigged trial, and it shows rather the abuse of rhetoric than any concept of justice. And again, you can see the copyists. Here is the whole chapter. I'll zoom it in. The second half, you see, here you can see it better. In the second scene, there are two parts of the manuscript that almost tell a different story, because the boxes on the upper right do not have corresponding boxes on the lower half, and vice versa. So there is a real bifurcation of the narrative. And the same you have at the end. On the right side, you see the very last scene. It may be covered by the images if, I see you, but I know what's there, but you may want to move the images. There's one part that has testimony as a legal tool, and the other part does not. So the chapter was retrofitted by someone going with the development of legal Islamic practice. And this shows you how the book was placed in real life, that it was an important interpretation of life of those people who kept rewriting it, of the copyist. And this is what I wanted to show you in the beginning. Mahmoud Koza has then used our very carefully curated data. We've spent much time on cleaning up our edition and putting it through a large language model, which then shows us similar passages. And from that marbleized colors, you can see, okay, the left group 5, this combination of those phrases in green and beige, they're all there together. They're not the same, but they're close to the early group of manuscripts. And then there are two on the sort of towards the right side middle that have the blues. And these are the Paris continuum. They were also rewritten, and this continuum has focuses on other trends. So this kind of cross-analysis tool based on large language model allows us to analyze with more speed what before we had to do with pencil and highlighters, and it took us a lot of time. So this is the advantage of artificial intelligence. If you train it well with carefully curated data, and also there are mistakes, but it is an enormous help making certain things automatic that we already know how to do them, but are very time consuming. It doesn't think for you. And this is the bottom half where you get the whole thing in little boxes, and that is maybe easier to see. I will close with the one chapter that is of particular interest to the global disaster concept. It's the chapter of the king of the mice. In this chapter, humans try to change the climate with the outcome that it doesn't work and the world burns up. That's the end of the story. In the chapter, it's about kings listening. I mean, they're intercalated stories. In the outer tale, the king actually listens to a tale of a king who did not listen. So the internal tale is the disaster. The external, the framing tale, is the king who listens, and he avoids disaster. So it's also about learning from the experience of others. It's a fable book. The interesting part is that this tale survives in an English idiom. It's called belling the cat. So the stories of, how can the mice get rid of the cat? And the one mouse said, we put bells around the cat's necks, then we know when they come. And then what the other mouse said, well, how do you do that? It stops there. So it was a stupid idea. And the idiom survives in English for trying to do something impossible. But then in the book by Ulrich Marzow, 101 Middle Eastern Tales, and they're all Western impact, he has a chapter on this tale. ATU is the Arne Thompson index of folkloric stories. They're all numbered through in a huge encyclopedia. It's very useful. And our expert on that is Ulrich Marzow. And he writes the transmission of this tale all the way through Europe. And it goes back first time to the older Syriac version from the 6th century. So it's a very old tale. But now I go back, and this is how it looks. Here we have the chapter title, Bab Mehraz, Meharzarman. The foreign names always get garbled because the Arab copyists don't recognize them, and they have no rules for them. So once they are, written a funny way, then they get copied and terrible things happen. So by Malik el-Jordan, king of the rats, mice and rats always interchange culturally. The Indian mice become Arabic rats and become, again, European mice. Khala de Shalim, so this is the chapter beginning. It never has illustrations, by the way. This chapter is never illustrated. And then, now I had, there's one sub-story then where the king tells about, the king's advisor tells him about the story of the mice and the rats, which then teaches the king in the outer story to behave wisely and not to endanger his subjects by doing irresponsible things that change the nature of the world. This is all I wanted to tell you. I can stop share, and we probably have no time for questions, but if you do, feel free to, I'm sorry I spoke a little bit too long, feel free to contact me, and I'd be happy to, respond. Also send you publications so far that we've brought on the way.
Wow, thank you so much, Beatrice. That's an amazing studies. And I did not realize that burying the cat, it's very different in that the original. And it is a climate change story.
Yes.
Yes. Do you have to go? It would be great because we are doing this like fables network, and then we can collaborate with you in the kind of for the future.
Absolutely.
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah. Anybody else have questions?
I mean, I think we can have a few questions for, I don't know, 5 minutes or so. I will just shorten my envisioned introduction for the panel and be.
Okay, I'll pass it to Chris.
So Heidi has one.
Yes, Beatrice, I have just one question. How many versions does the project involve? I mean, how many versions of Kalīla and Dimna did you work on in order to have this kind of language model in the end? Because that means that you worked on so many different versions, even Arabic versions. I know that there are so many different Arabic versions of Ibn al-Muqaffa, the translation of Ibn al-Muqaffa, and it survived along the years, and it was added to, and as you said, omitted, and several versions. But all in all, can you just give me the total number? And how many languages did you have to read of that, of Kalīla and Dimna, of the translations of Kalīla and Dimna?
I can quickly show you the page in my, while I respond to your question. We have so far collected 179 manuscripts, know about. Of these, we have 119 PDFs of manuscripts, but some of them are also closer copies of others, or they are similar. So the groups of manuscripts that you need to get to cover the maximum spectrum of change is what per chapter is about 15. Here I show you the group of manuscripts from A to P. We always give them letters in the edition. They represent 4 continua, this kind of thing that I said before. Then we have the early manuscripts of the 14th century that fall outside. And then the cross-copied manuscripts, we always take 2 that do thus most. This lands up with 15 manuscripts needed to do an edition. And then any further manuscripts of which we know so far can be placed within that spectrum of change. And it doesn't mean that there are not some idiosyncratic, crazy manuscripts that change everything around or cut or abridge, but those we leave out in our editions because the edition is more the middle of the road spread of change against which then the very unusual ones are measured. There are also versifications. And so we have to, after our experience, we look back onto 6 years of not in the beginning, not knowing what you're doing, transcribing selected chapters and then combining them and then figuring this out. So over the 6 years, this is what we found out, but it was a laborious process.
Of course.
And in terms of the languages, when we have a weekly colloquium, and I hired people who do Syriac and Persian, and our project partners do Spanish and Greek, and we read, and we also have the German version, which is close to modern German. It's lovely. And our Syriac postdoc Jan van Ginkel, he also handles the Latin. So we read sentence or segment by segment in all the languages. And this is how over the years we figured out a sense of how much does this version change or rewrite, or which Arabic manuscript is it closer to than others. And of course, that may change from chapter to chapter, but this is how we have found out that the Castilian is indeed quite close. And the Castilian, the Hebrew, which is a different branch, yet still very close. And the Latin is a translation of the Hebrew. And out of that, all the Western European versions come. And they all belong to what we call the Iberian continuum. Mm-hmm. So that's very helpful to know now where we can place, so along which continuum can we place which version. And the majority, I would say, of our manuscripts fit into one of the 4 continua, other than, those that combine or those that are really way out there and do their own thing.
Wow. Well, thank you so much. That must be one long journey.
You have to be chaos tolerant.
Yes, of course. Thank you so much.
And Chris, you wanted to say something?
Yes. So is there no other questions? So I'm not a literature scholar or a historian, but an anthropologist.
Mhm.
And so from time to time, you mentioned that this cross-copying and changes through the time is clearly politically motivated or socially needs social contextualization. So I'm interested how much of this interpretation is also part of your project and work, that you try to explain the changes in the corpus or copy or different continua with the actual historical, political, social situation of the times when these changes occurred.
This is where we work as a team. So a person who deals more with the social political surroundings and also the language history is my postdoc Johannes Stephan, for instance. So in our book, each of those people focuses on one thing, or there's an earlier imitation, and that my colleague Isabel Toral has worked on more. When I look at the text, I notice things. For instance, anything having to do with material objects, clothes, food, or legal contracts, hiring somebody to commit a crime, for instance, or the legal procedures in a court of law. Those things get what we call in narratology actualized. So you have actualization of social terms, social situations. You also get added detail, but that's on the narratological side. But the added detail can also give you bits and pieces of day-to-day culture from a certain period. Beyond that, this is beyond my expertise, and I will then, ask the help of social historians of the 18th and 19th century. But the interesting part of the 18th, 19th century, this is when sub-elite book writing begins, when people who are not perfect scholars, there is a fantastic book by my colleague Dana Sajdi on the barber of Damascus, some barber who started writing a book in Middle Arabic. So this is no longer the highest level of the language, but a slightly simplified register. So the surfacing of non-elite authors is a phenomenon of the 18th century, and they're often physicians or they're travelers. So they are somewhat educated, but sometimes autodidacts. So a new layer of the population starts having an authorial voice. And what we find in our fable story, people don't say they do that, but it's obvious. So it's like it develops into the a sub-elite type of authorship. And that one in general, one can say. And then for specific cases where there is a strong opinion on things, then I would really need help from social historians if I wanted to get deeper into that.
Okay, fascinating. I mean, I have tons of more questions, but I think we are actually already running a little bit late, Kaori, right? So
write an email to me,
okay.
and I'll be happy to first of all answer, but also on some of the things we've already publications, and I send a bunch of PDFs to everybody.
Yeah, let's see, especially when it comes to your colleague, you mentioned this postdoc who works on the contemporary use. So this would be also very interesting how internal reception at the moment in the region also picks up these stories and uses it. And I think this kind of connects to Heidi's talk already a bit. So yeah, let's stay connected.
Yeah, that is absolutely the case. There is indeed also what one of my doctoral candidates has Heidi Bayoumy has found out. There is actual oral storytelling that comes out of that. And I just wanted to show you one more thing. Pardon me, I'm just trying to find it in my emails. because a useful this is a forthcoming book. So in about a month from now, this is the book cover I just got from the publisher to look at. No, I have to move. Yeah, screen sharing. Okay, it doesn't let me move. Yeah, here it is. This is an unruly classic. And this is sort of the outcome of the first 6 years. I'm hoping that will be in print in a month or two from now. And this has actually a lot of the things that I said today.
Okay, many thanks again.
Thank you. So enjoy your conference and
Yes.
keep in touch.
Yes, we keep in touch.
Okay.
Thank you.
Good.
Thank you.
So I guess I just continue, or do I? Yes. So
Yes.
yeah, I intended to speak a page long on the concept and background idea of this panel, and I think I keep it a little bit shorter so that we all have a lunch break afterwards. So thanks again for Kaori for bringing us again together in the Rethinking Fables community. Yesterday was already very fascinating and intense and brought many migration stories of fables in other world regions together. And this panel kind of reflects my own personal regional interest and focus on the Mediterranean, understood as a broad region, which also includes the interactions and interconnections with the wider Arabic or Arab and Islamic region. So the main idea of today's panel is to explore very specific migration paths and continuities of fables across this region, and therefore we have 3 panelists and experts who all brought their own fabulous work and fables with us, and they will present this and ideally at the end allow us to have a comparative perspective on the circulation of fables in the Mediterranean. So our first speaker is Mariagrazia from University of Florence in Italy. She is an environmental humanities philosopher and works on aesthetics and biodiversity conversation. So she will present to us the 19th century super famous thinker, Giacomo Leopardi, and his work on moral fables. And I have to admit that before Mariagrazia highlighted his popularity, I didn't know that Giacomo Leopardi is such a thing. So secondly, Heidi Bayoumy from Cairo University will give us an insight on an ecocritical reading of selected Arabic animal stories and plays for children. So covering or changing the temporal perspective from this rather classic perspective we already heard from Beatrice, and looking on the continuity, how modern animal fables are told and even enacted on stage. And lastly, Kevin Blankinship from Brigham Young University, who is not here because he has Arabic lessons at the moment in Jordan, but he will join us soon, I hope, will bring us or introduce us his work on the Arabic scholar and controversial thinker of Abu Al-Maʻarrī, who also nicely connects to, I think, this uncanniness we already heard about Kalīla and Dimna, because his work is also very hard to categorize and put into a box. And he will present us how Al-Maʿarrī's animal fables kind of convey the author's political and moral agenda. So altogether, I hope that we have 3, or with Beatrice's contribution, or 4 concrete fables or genealogies of fables, which then allow us to discuss interconnections between them, and also their role and importance for our current crisis and times. So the idea is that we have all 3 presentations with short Q&A for understandings, one after another, and then at the end, with the last minutes remaining, have the final discussion. So thanks again for all who are here in the audience, our panelists and Kaori, and let's begin with Mariagrazia.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, great. Okay, thanks, Christoph, for this introduction. Thanks for inviting me. I would say it's something more like an experiment for me to take part in this panel, in the sense that first thing is that all this idea of me presenting Leopardi's moral fables started because in June I was in Cologne, talking with Christoph about ecocriticism and environmental humanities, and at a certain point we realized that among my colleagues in Cologne, Giacomo Leopardi wasn't that much famous as he is actually in Italy. I would say he's the most relevant Italian literary scholar and author in the 19th, 20th century. And he has been rediscovered in recent years as an ecocriticism scholar, or a scholar interesting also from an environmental perspective. So I would say for me, it's like an experiment to provide you with some insights into his work, in particular his work called Small Moral Fables, so small moral works. I will present 3 of these very short narratives, and let's see what happens. Really take my short contribution as something more like an experiment. Let's see if you can take something from Giacomo Leopardi's work on moral fables. Okay, the question that I decided to use as an entry point into Giacomo Leopardi's work in these operette morali, small moral works, is the following. Is it possible for literature to authentically give voice to the non-human? That's the point in Giacomo Leopardi's short moral fables. I have a couple of slides. I'm trying to, let's see if I can, yeah, here, should be here. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Yeah, great. Okay, no more than a couple of slides here. Mood presentation. Okay, great. Here we are. This is Giacomo Leopardi. Okay, oh God. Okay, this is Giacomo Leopardi. The small moral works or small moral fables are a collection of very short narratives written between 1824 and 1832. First edition 1827, then another edition 10 years later, then a final revised version in 1837. Giacomo Leopardi died in 1837, so the final edition is just 2 years before him dying. And I've selected 3 of these short moral fables, which are the following: a dialogue between a sprite and a gnome in praise of the birds, and a chant of a wild cock. Now, Giacomo Leopardi is a man from the 19th century, so he was born in 1798 and died, as said, in 1837. So his understanding of nature, of course, is different than our own today. Markedly different from our present-day understanding of nature, which is shaped by environmental crisis, biodiversity loss, climate change. But in any case, Leopardi is interesting, I think, and particularly in these short, small moral fables, because his critique of the anthropocentrism anticipates some key concerns in contemporary ecological thought, some key concerns in contemporary environmental humanities, in particular this idea of a world animated by a plurality of non-human forces and agencies. So that's the main point in his fables. Why am I using this notion of fable? Actually, it's impossible to apply a kind of precise or standardized or fixed definition of fables to Giacomo Leopardi's work, in the sense that, I mean, is used as this notion. So I'm using this notion of fables with reference to his works, mainly because of the prominent presence of zoomorphic elements in this text. Although that's the first thing that I want to remark, every time in all these texts, all collected in these operette morali, fables, so this genre of fable, as always a kind of satirical touch. So you have to keep in mind that it's a kind of use of zoomorphic characters as main characters in all these brief texts, also with the aim of carrying out a kind of socio-political critique of his own age. So this understanding of the genre of fables is very much interconnected with satire. So we may say that to dismantle the anthropocentric illusions, Leopardi adopts in his fables a satirical touch or a fabulist intonation of a satire. And of course, he had a kind of models in mind, in particularly an author pretty well known at that time in Italy, Giambattista Casti, who wrote a work called Animali Parlanti, the Speaking Animals, which was a kind of epic poem of zoopolitical satire published in 1802. So every time you read one of these operette morali, it's a kind of mixture, very interesting, but it makes the genre pretty much indeterminate. It's a kind of mixture between fables and satires. So that's the first point I want to stress before looking more precisely into the three operette morali I've selected. The second preliminary remark, is that Leopardi, throughout his own life, had an enduring curiosity about the animal kingdom. Like the first work, it was a fable actually that he wrote when he was 12 years old, was a short fable on birds entitled The Bird, and then he dedicated works both in prose and in poetry and as a narrative to a wide variety of animals, including mice, frogs, crabs. So it was particularly open to this idea of including into his own texts as an intellectual from the 19th century, the non-human presence as a kind of non-human voice. He wanted to give space into his own work. We may say that by adopting the mask of the non-human animal in his fables, and thus drawing from the Aesopic tradition of the fable with animals as main characters, Leopardi wanted to step outside himself, outside mankind, tout court, and observe the world from a different, defamiliarized perspective. And from this vantage point, he criticized the human illusion, which in any case he recognized as an unavoidable human illusion of being at the center of the world and having all the nature at his disposal. So you see, he's writing fables with this kind of satirical touch, and his main point is a criticism against anthropocentrism. So these are the three main points if we want to understand something of the operette morali. I've selected the three operette morali, as said. The first one is the dialogue between a sprite and a gnome in praise of the birds, and then a chant of a wild cock. Let's start with the first one. The dialogue between a sprite and a gnome has these three non-human characters as main characters. It's quite hilarious, has a tone. So the two the sprite and the gnome met one morning and realize you can see I quoted some parts of the text, right? The start of the text, and notice something has changed, has happened on Earth, because humans are nowhere to be found. The human species has vanished. There is the sprite that meeting the gnome asks, "Where are you, Huff?" And the sprite and the gnome answers, "My father sent me to figure out what on earth those rascals, the human beings, are up to." Is very suspicious because for some time now they haven't caused any trouble and not a single one can be found anywhere in this realm. So they're starting to question, they're starting to ask themselves why the humans are no more to be found anywhere. And at a certain point they realize in a very, the text is very hilarious, is very comical, makes the reader laugh. They realized that the human species can completely extinct. So this idea that human had of being the center of the earth vanishes with the extinction of the human species, because on one hand they realized, the gnome and the sprites, that humans are nowhere to be found. On the other hand, they also realized that the earth continues to thrive, that the sea, the air, the mountains are completely indifferent and do not in any way mourn the disappearance of the humankind. And that's an interesting point in the sense that the tone of the operetta, as said, is quite ridiculizing, is quite hilarious, is quite comical, is quite satirical, but Leopardi is addressing a very dramatic point: the human extinction, the vanishment, the complete disappearance of the human species from Earth. As said, as we know from some philosophical reflections from Leopardi, according to Leopardi, anthropocentrism, although he criticizes anthropocentrism in these fables, is unavoidable in the sense that it's a kind of natural, inescapable human inclination. And in fact, in this operetta in particular, Leopardi demonstrates that anthropocentrism, this idea of being the center of the universe, which is so peculiar to humans, is not just for humans. In the sense that any species has more or less the same inclination of considering itself the center of the universe. The second quotation, the second part of this quote that I put in this slide demonstrates exactly this point, which is quite humorously illustrated in the fable. As the gnome and the sprite started to laugh at this idea of humans of being at the center of the world, which is absolutely false because they have vanished and the world continues to thrive, nothing has happened, they, while speaking to each other, reveal that they hold exactly the similar view for themselves. The gnome believes that the world was made for gnomes and the sprite for sprites. And you can read this passage, which is quite hilarious. They, human beings, used to believe that the world was created and preserved for them alone. And they simply would not understand that it was created and preserved for sprites. Now, that's a bit too sprightly if you're speaking seriously. Why? I'm speaking completely seriously. Oh, get away with you, you buffoon. They are talking together, the sprite and the gnomes. Everyone knows the world was created for gnomes. So you see, while criticizing this idea of humans of being at the center of the universe, letting the gnome and the sprite laughing at this human idea, they themselves demonstrate to be inclined towards the same understanding of their position in the world. The gnome's gnome-centric, so to speak, and the sprite-centric. And apart from being hilarious, this text demonstrates, or this fable demonstrates, that, as said, for Leopardi, anthropocentrism, or this idea of each species to be the center of his own world, is a kind of biological, unavoidable tendency. And it's quite paradoxical the way in which this criticism is carried out, in the sense that this criticism of anthropocentrism is carried out so that the two non-human characters that laugh at humans, in the end, it's like they are speaking like they were humans. So it's a kind of admission that anthropocentrism on the one hand should be criticized, and that's the main point of the fables. On the other hand, it's absolutely impossible to escape this very biological, very natural tendency, which is not, as said, only for humans. And this is a point which emerged in very different ways throughout the operette morali. So if we want, that's the other point, if we want to give a voice in literature, as Leopardi is trying to do, to non-human agencies, to non-human species, at a certain point, anthropocentrism is a kind of problem which cannot completely get rid of, so to speak. The second operetta morale that I've selected is quite different, but has again to do with this idea of giving voice to the non-human. It's the In Praise of the Birds, which has a different touch. It's a quite peculiar operetta in the collection of the operette morali, in the sense that, if I would say, the 90% of the operette morali has this kind of mixed touch between fables and satires. The Praise of a Bird is a kind of unique text because it's more like poetical, it's kind more elegiac tone, which is quite different from the other texts included in the collection. The In Praise of a Bird start in quite a different, in quite a peculiar way. That's the beginning of the operetta. The scenery is the following. The main character is a man who has no voice. Keep in mind this point. That's the beginning of the operetta. Amelius, a solitary philosopher, was sitting one morning with his books in the shade of his country house and reading, when he was struck by the sound of birds singing throughout the countryside. Gradually, he began to listen and reflect, and he ceased reading. Eventually, he took a pen in hand and wrote as follows. And then the text, the fable, continues with this Amelius writing a eulogy of birds. So the man, the human presence, so to speak, transcribes the voice of the non-human that he hears. He doesn't speak. He has no voice on his own. What Amelius writes in this In Praise of the Birds is, as said, an eulogy of the birds, which describes the birds as non-human animals by their nature, the happiest creatures in the world, carefree and joyful more than other creatures. Amelius notes that the birds have a nature that is truly adapted to enjoyment and happiness, and he notes in this eulogy that they seem, the birds, not subject to boredom, which is a great difference from human beings, because they are constantly in motion. They travel from one place to another, regardless of distance, and from the lowest to highest regions of the air, with remarkable ease. They experience a myriad of diverse phenomena in their lives. They continually exercise their body. They possess an unusual abundance of external life. So in this operetta, in this fable about the solitary philosophers and the birds are like the symbol or the figure that embodies the good life, both intrinsically and extrinsically allied with other forms of life, characterized by dynamism and cheerfulness, which is not for humans, according to Leopardi. The human voice is said, the voice of the solitary philosophers cannot be heard. It's absent, actually, which is a kind of way that Leopardi adopts in order to go in the direction of this decentering the human from this his position of his anthropocentric illusion, his position of being at the center of the world. So he has no voice, the Amélius, who is nevertheless one of the characters of the operetta. The only thing that humans in this operetta do is transcribing the voice of the non-human. Exactly the same thing happens in the third operetta, in the third fables, which is even more interesting. It's the chant of the wildcock. And this operetta has again to do with this idea of hearing non-human voices and the human beings that only have the possibility of transcribing with no words on their own the voice that they can hear. This is how the operetta begins. Certain Hebrew authorities and writers affirm that between heaven and earth, or rather halfway between the two, there lives a certain wildcock, with its feet standing on the earth and its crest and beak touching the sky. So we know that Leopardi was pretty much familiar with the traditions of Hebrew literature, and he took this figure of the wildcock as a figure of a non-human animal halfway between the heaven and earth, as a kind of figure of the mediation between what is human and what is non-human. But again, here, the only possibility for humans is to transcribe the chant of the wild cock. This gigantic cock possesses the use of reasons, explains Leopardi in the fable, or at least, he says, it has been taught by unknown means to enunciate words as humans do, or as humans did, because in this fable, human, as said, did not speak at all. Humans did not speak, they merely transcribed the voice that resounds, which is the non-human voice of the cock. And the fables goes further. In an ancient parchment written in Hebrew letters, a canticle has been found entitled Morning Canticle of the Wild Cock. And the author of the operetta writes, of course fictionally, I managed to understand thoroughly and render into our vulgar tongue, as can be seen in the following, the chant, but I have not yet discovered whether this canticle is repeated by the cock every morning, periodically, or only once, or has heard it. So there is this voice that can be heard or was heard in the past, and someone who does not speak that has transcribed these non-human voices. What's the main point of the chant of the wild cock of this fable? This figure of the cock staying midway between the earth and the heaven is supposed to remind every morning to humans that although their life can be full of sufferings, which is one of the main points in all the operette morali by Leopardi, still they have to get up because the hour of the absolute silence and of death is not yet arrived. So it's a kind of voice that reminds humans that they have to stop sleeping and every morning being active again, because the time of their definite rest is not yet come. And the conclusion of the fable of the wild cock is absolutely beautiful from a literary point of view. I've quoted here exactly the final lines of the operetta, and I read them for you. While inviting every morning with his voice the humans to get up and going back to their everyday activity, the wild cock, at a certain point right at the end of the operetta, prefigures this time in which, again, all the human species will be completely vanished, and perhaps even the other non-human species in the universe, and a complete silence will dominate. It's a kind of attempt in this fable, which is quite peculiar in his own asset, in his own setting, in the context of the works by Giacomo Leopardi. It's a kind of attempt to describe how would the universe look like once all the living beings, not just humans, will be completely vanished. The time will come when this universe and nature herself will be spent. And just as the greatest realms and humans' empires and their marvelous deeds, which in other ages were most famous, no trace of fame remains today, so of the whole world and the infinite events and calamities of creation, no vestige will remain, but a vast silence and deep quiet will fill the immensity of space. So this marvelous and terrifying mystery of universal existence, before it is either declared or understood, will disappear and be lost. There is one thing that interests me very much in these three different operette, and it's this dimension of an auditory component that emerges in different ways in all these three texts, and in particular in the praise of the birds and in this chant of the wild cock. Because as you see, as already said, the human component has no voice anymore. Only non-human species have a voice. The only tasks for humans is this kind of transcription of a word, which is no more their own words. But at this stage, with the last lines of the chant of the wild cock, all kind of different voices, even the non-human ones, vanishes, and what remains is these marvelous and terrifying bare silence, a deep quiet that will fill the immensity of space. So here, I think that the use of fables by Leopardi is quite interesting because it's a kind of so radical reversal of hierarchies that the human emerges here, particularly in these two last operette morali, so the-centered that it is merely the transcriber, now silent, while much more powerful is or the voice of the non-human or the complete silence that will cover all the remaining traces of the presence of something living in the universe. As an intellectual from the 19th century, this idea of Leopardi of trying to use his own language, his own works, in order to give voice either to the non-human or to the complete silence of the post-apocalyptic or the post-extinction universe. It's quite interesting. And in the last 20 years, more or less, or even less, in the last 10 years, there have been nationally, I mean, in Italy and internationally, many attempts at looking at his work from an environmental perspective, trying to introduce his work within the set of works usually considered as reference point for the research in the environmental humanities. It was for me like a kind of challenge or an experiment to present these three examples of fables by Leopardi, also because it would be interesting for me to trace back the possible origins of these symbols, images of non-human animals that he uses. We can reconstruct reconstruct, for instance, for sure, the set of readings that led Leopardi to the definition of these images of non-human animals, the wild cock, the sprite, the gnomes, and all these kind of images. But still, it would be interesting for me to see whether there is, for these images, for instance, a much wider circulation in the Mediterranean area, for instance, or if Leopardi can be considered as a kind of reference point in terms of rethinking the genre of fables from an environmental perspective, although his own understanding of the environmental questions and issues and of the concept of nature itself was obviously quite different from our own. And yeah, that's all. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk a bit about Leopardi's fables.
Thank you so much, Mariagrazia,
Great.
for bringing us this important thinker a little bit closer. So can you stop screen sharing?
Yes.
So we have now, let's say, 4 minutes before we proceed to our next presenter. Are there any direct questions to Mariagrazia's talk? So okay, so I put myself into the back and reserve my question. So there's Kaori raised her hand first, and then Emanuele.
Yeah, quick question. Well, this is fantastic. Like I love that the bird one because it's like a heaven and earth, which is basically making whole environment in the space of the fable in a sense. But anyway, my question is that did he know British romanticism, like people who are writing about nature? And if so, what was his sense of like Wordsworth and so on, writing about nature at the time?
Yeah, of course. I mean, he was able to read English. I mean, for me, I hope it wasn't too much an experiment in the terms that I'm not a literary scholar. But in any case, I'm interested in Leopardi because from a philosophical point of view, apart from this text, which are literary texts, of course, from a philosophical point of view, he's quite an interesting thinker. He was very much familiar with English literature, with Romanticism. He was quite critical towards Romanticism as poetical stance, so to speak, and particularly Italian Romanticism. He was absolutely against German Romanticism. He had some kind of preconceptions against German philosophy and Kant and the whole German Romanticism, also from a theoretical point of view, I mean. But his own understanding of this kind of questions, of course, owe very much to some topics and issues that were under discussion in the English literary environment. So, for instance, this idea of this terrible quiet, of course, the sublime, the importance of the category of the sublime, and this idea not just to use the category of the sublime in terms of trying to give the reader of the operette morali this sense of a sublime aesthetic judgment, but to reconstruct also from a stylistic and rhetoric point of view the use of words. Of course, I had to translate into English, but if you read the text in Italian, you can notice very well the effort of producing something like a use also sonary, auditory component of the language, of course, which has very much to do with this idea of reproducing in a sense, also auditorily, when you read aloud, for instance, a text, the sense of something that happens in a kind of not silent but different sound of the words put together to give the idea of this kind of post-apocalyptic or post-extinction scenery. So yeah, it would be interesting to reconstruct the phylogenesis, so to speak, of these images that he uses in the operette morali.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gary.
Emanuele?
Yeah, thank you for the very interesting presentation. I have to admit that although I'm Italian and I know Leopardi, I'm not really an expert of Leopardi, but yeah, I found it very interesting. I think it's interesting how to see that I think this is a very Eurocentric point of view, that we are at the center, we Europeans are at the center of the world, and to imagine that every human being would put themselves at the center of the world. So it's speaking about its time and about an Eurocentric perspective. But I don't know, I think I would disagree about the fact that in the second or the third operette, the human has no voice, because the transcriber is, for me at least, somebody that can speak upon somebody else. So to frame, to narrate, it's a form of authority. So perhaps I would say that Leopardi grasped that we, European, fail to see the world as inhabited by other creatures, non-human agents, and therefore we cannot speak with, but we can just speak upon them. What do you think about this?
Okay, there is something that I haven't stressed because I was, I wasn't sure about how much I have already talked. That's a big question. That's a big issue going on in the operette morali between two different domains of the words, the spoken words and the written words. When I say that humans have no voice, I have in mind the auditory component of voice. It doesn't mean that they have no voice in the sense that they cannot positionate themselves in terms of exerting an authority. In Leopardi, there is a very big question about the two dimensions of orality and writing. So orality in the sense of oral circulation of literary traditions, for instance, and on the other hand, written circulation of literary books, for instance. So it's a big point in his own poetics. So saying that humans have no voice means, in this specific case, this contraposition, for instance, as you can see from the situation of the Amelius, the solitary philosophers, is writing and reading, and then he stops because he hears something which is the voice of the birds, and then he transcribes. So Leopardi does not allow in his text the voice of the humans to be described as something which is spoken, so to speak, pronounced. Okay, the contraposition is not between authority, position, and non-positioning himself as an authority. The contraposition is between the domain of the orality and the domain of the written literature. So that's the point. That's the point. I don't know if now it's clearer.
Yeah, thank you for clarifying.
Yeah, thank you.
Fantastic. So I think we have to move on to our next speaker, who I'm very delighted to briefly introduce to you. Heidi Bayoumy is currently an associate professor at the Department of English Literature and Language at the Cairo University in Egypt. And she's not only an author of many research papers and books on in the field of environmental children's literature and comparative literature and drama, but she's also a writer of short stories for children. So she teaches courses on drama, translation, cultural studies, And in her recent works, she focuses on children's literature from the lens of ecofeminism and critical disaster studies. In her book, a study of the role of creatures in plays and films for children, she offers a comparative approach to Arabic and world children's literature from the perspective of semiotics, ecocriticism, and psychoanalysis. So I'm very, very pleased that you join us in this panel, because we just get introduced or met each other on a DAAD event in Cairo, and agreed on that we definitely have to kind of cooperate and collaborate in the future, and that this is now in this very limited time already accomplished is a very nice thing. So I hand over to you, and looking forward to your talk.
Thank you so much, Christoph. It's such an honor, and thank you so much for making this happen, because it was your efforts the beginning of the day and from the very beginning to the end. So I'm very grateful to you. Thank you, Corey, for hosting this great event. So I'm really honored to be a part of it. Allow me to share my screen. So I'm just gonna, okay. I hope you can see my screen now.
Yes, all fine.
Okay, all right. So I'm going to be talking about revisiting ecological animal stories and plays for children. And of course, while I was doing my research, while I was preparing for this presentation, I realized that this is a genre, or the genre of fables and animal stories, specifically in Egypt, is a genre that has been flourishing throughout the ages. It's a genre that is constantly growing, changing. The tone keeps changing, the themes keep changing, and it has always been an attractive genre for children, not just because it's a means of reflecting culture, and when translated, it presents a completely different culture to children in Egypt, in the Arab world, so it introduces them to the West, and vice versa. But it's also, and this is again from an ecocritical perspective, especially when these animal stories for children have ecological dimensions or environmental themes, these fables are a means of acting as a mirror to children, telling them where we stand ecologically, what are we doing towards nature, how are we responding to the climate change crisis, or different crises, natural crises that we are witnessing right now. So one of the questions that I was thinking of, why is this genre keep developing, and why do we have so many stories, animal stories for children at the moment in Egypt and in the Arab world? And I had to go back a little bit, and I'm just going to give you a very quick overview of the different sources of influence that still, until this day, influence writers for children. The first source of influence is definitely the Holy Quran, and because it's full of so many different animal stories, narrated and told about prophets, and even apart from prophets. So it is still a very important source. And if you check the current publishing houses in Egypt and in the Arab world, you will find numerous productions and versions of the animals stories in the Quran being retold over and over from different perspectives and for different purposes, whether educational purposes or for didactic purposes, which is the essence of this genre in particular. And the second important source, which Beatrice spoke about beautifully early in the morning, is definitely Kalīla and Dimna. And it was the translation of Ibn al-Muqaffa that influenced a lot of writers, later writers, to begin to think about this genre. He's the one who actually introduced this genre into Arabic literature. And the contemporaneous of Ibn al-Muqaffa, who's Sahl ibn Harun, he was the one who actually decided upon reading Kalīla and Dimna that he wanted to write a similar fable. So he started writing Tola and Afra and the Tiger and the Fox. And these are two important books that he, in which he imitates the style of Kalīla and Dimna. And he tries to write his own version of animal stories. However, I must say that the coming two sources are incredibly important sources for children writers of fables or animal stories, which is Al-Dahi's animal stories and Al-Damiri's life of animals. These, you would never meet an Egyptian writer of animal stories without him telling you or her telling you that they have been greatly influenced by these two books in particular. And therefore, they're a very important stop when it comes to or stage or position when it comes to the sources of influence on children's writers. However, the greatest influence of all comes in the early 20th century by Ahmad Shawqi. And Ahmad Shawqi is a renowned poet, and he was given the title of the Prince of Poets. Ahmad Shawqi decided to develop this genre, and he was the first one to present it to children. So this was a great transition in the development of the genre. So he decided to write hawadith, or tales, which was simplified tales, animal tales, presented in verse, beautiful verse, easy verse to learn and to even sing for children. So this was a great development and a great kind of evolution, because this genre started to be directed towards different audience, towards children. So whereas we always had Kalīla and Dimna and Al-Jahid and Al-Damiri's books, we started having different sources of influence. And a lot of writers for children, they confess and they always talk about the influence of Ahmad Shawqi, because he was the one who simplified the language even of these fables in order to suit children. So this was a great point in the history of this genre, development of this genre when it comes to children's literature. And in turn, he was the one who influenced a lot of writers to come, especially Kamil al-Kilani, who's considered the pioneer of Egyptian children's literature, or the pioneer of children's literature in Egypt and the Arab world. And he's the one who actually started developing fables even more. And he wrote in verse, just to clarify. He was different from Ahmad Shawqi. He was influenced by Ahmad Shawqi, but he decided to write in verse. Let me show you why he's given the term pioneer. This is simply because he wrote 1,000 stories for children. And of course, that's a huge number. The published stories are only 200. And after his death, his son published only 100. So we still have almost 700 stories in his library that we don't have access to. The majority of these stories are fables, are animal stories. And the other, and let's say 70%, and the other 30% are divided into retellings of folk tales, retellings of famous plays, like even King Lear by Shakespeare, by William Shakespeare. So this man was a prolific writer, and his style in fables is very, very different. It is true that his language is a bit complicated and sophisticated, but it's also his books are worth visiting because they mark a great change in and the development of the genre when it comes to targeting children audience or children readers. Another important stop or writer is definitely Yaqub al-Sharuni, who also was influenced by Kamil al-Kilani. And in turn, let me tell you that there's a wonderful series that has been published in Egypt for years, and it's called the Green Series Library. And this series of books consists of a lot of fables and a lot of animal stories, whether original or retellings of Kalīla and Dimna. And Yaqub al-Sharuni has written a lot of books, and his books were published in that Green series. Similarly, we have other writers, Asma Abu Talib, Mahmoud Qasim, Sayyida Hamid, and from the Arab world, we have a Lebanese writer, Al-Bar Mutlaq. I'm going to talk about his series as well. He participated in what is called the Butterfly series, which is published by Lebanon Publishing House. And also it involves a lot of retellings of animal stories and fables from Kalīla and Dimna. And there is Al-Arabi bin Jaloun, who's a Moroccan writer as well, who wrote animal stories and fables for children. When we examine their works, because I had to do a lot of reading of these writers, they're influenced by, as I said, Ahmad Shawqi's, but they're also influenced by Kalīla and Dimna. So most of the works revolve around either original animal stories that they've written or retellings of Kalīla and Dimna or Alf Layla Layla or the 1000 Nights. They're written in essence and primarily for moral lessons, to provide children with right kind of values and educational purposes, some of them even for teaching the alphabet, the Arabic alphabet. So this is what the works revolve around. And this is what I told you a minute ago about, which is the Green Series libraries and the Butterfly series, which again, as you can see, retellings of folk tales, but they're also retellings of fables and animal stories. So because of all this is very important. It shows you and it gives you an idea of why this genre keeps developing and changing. So despite the abundance of animal stories and fables for children, it was an arduous task to find ecological animal stories, to find animal stories with a kind of environmental theme or environmental concerns. And this led me to an idea or a very important question that we need to revisit again these ecological animal stories, and we need to check what kind of themes are they presenting, because despite all the arguments directed to fables and animal stories, which are beautifully summed in a wonderful article by Sean Bex, it's very important to have this kind of ecocritical perspective when visiting these ecological fables, because they can tell us something about animals, about our relationship with the environment, and how do we deal actually with the animals and with the environment. So by revisiting these fables or animal stories, we're helping children understand reading these fables through the eyes of children, and seeing what kind of lessons are presented to them, and how do these fables help children understand about environmental threats. Because all the time we have to be aware that children are not distant from what's happening in the world. In the Anthropocene right now, the age of the Anthropocene, children are exposed to disasters all the time, whether natural or man-made, wars and displacement, especially in the Arab world. So when we have fables written about these ecological crises or environmental crises, this is very important because it creates this kind of ecological awareness and helping children understand where do we stand. And also by using ecocriticism, it gives a kind of perspective, broader perspective of the linkage between children's literature and animal stories as part of children's literature, of course, and ecocriticism or the environment on a broader scale. So the selected animal stories that I wanted to be part of my presentation are actually 4 selected stories, Egyptian and as well one a Lebanese story. And my initial observations were how these stories vary in their structure, how they're structured inside the books, and how they're divided into different parts. What do they tell? Some of them are merging of scientific perspective together with the literary, which is very interesting, as I'm going to show in a minute. Some of them have a different narrative structure. So the narration shifts from one point of view, from one narrator to the other, from one animal to the other. And we get to see it through the eyes of the animals as they narrate or what they tell about themselves. Sometimes it's the third person narrator. So the narrative structure even changes and the point of view keeps shifting and changes. And the themes are also different and they're various because they range from simple kind of 1 or 2 lines about, for instance, droughts and starvation and famines and scarcity of water to the intrusion of humans on the animal world. So they vary in their degrees of touching upon environmental themes and ecological concerns. The first book that I wanted to be part of this presentation, not just because from an emotional perspective, this book was one of the books that I used to read as a child and I used to study at school, but also it's a very important source because it acted as a great influence later on to other writers, which is The Elephant Plays Leapfrog, Adventures and Anecdotes of Animals. Now, the book is divided into 2 parts. That's the interesting thing about it, the structure itself. The first part is about animal stories told from a literary perspective. But the second part, we have a more objective description of these animals after introducing them in the stories. So the writer keeps telling us about, okay, we talked about, for instance, the hippopotamus. So now we're going to talk about the animal in terms of height, weight, eating habits, and that it's in the zoo. So the second part, it's more like introducing children to the animals in the zoo itself. So they told the writer, and the drawings of Hosni, they give the children an idea of what these animals are like and what they do. So the first part talks and touches upon different issues like droughts, talks about, again, despite this kind of main theme that envelops the story, for instance, like drought and animals are rushing and they're having a problem, they can't find water. But beneath this layer, environmental layer, there's a very important didactic layer as well. How should we act at times of crisis? So the first story gives an idea that, again, whenever there's drought or scarcity of food, selfishness cannot emerge, that we need to unite and work together because the environment is already collapsing at this moment. So we need to wait until nature revives itself, until the season of rain is back again. And through a wonderful story about the hippopotamus and what its selfishness has done, we see actually this lesson beautifully delivered. The second collection of animal stories is a beautiful one by Mohamed Al-Makhzanki, Animals Nowadays. This one is completely different from the animal stories I've read, but it's a bit influenced by the previous one because it's also divided into two parts, into two sections. The interesting part of it is that Mohamed Al-Makhzengi in many interviews says, I was greatly influenced by Al-Jahid and by Al-Dimiri, and that's why I had to mention them at the very beginning of my presentation. So he says at the beginning of each animal story, he introduces the animals like the horse, and then he would introduce a quote. This quote could be from Al-Jahid, this quote could be from Man and Animals by Yuri Dmitriev, or The Life of Animals by Al-Dimiri, or The Personality of Animals by Harold Monroe Fox. There is always this quote, one or two at the beginning of the chapter, and then he would proceed by giving this kind of story, literary story about the animal itself. So the structure is very different. Again, when it comes to the ecological themes he touches upon, definitely drought is one of them, and climate change effects are one of the themes that he touches upon. But what is very interesting and attractive is the idea of having quotes from these old sources, acknowledging that they have a great effect on them. And in a way, they direct children towards these books so that they can go back and read these different quotes about these different animals. The third one is The Small Parrot by Albert Mutlaq, the Lebanese writer. Is very famous for writing fables and animal stories. And the story is very interesting because it talks about parrots and how they're beautiful, these beautiful birds, which are rarely seen in nature, and how they are all the time hunted by animals, a sort of trophy or treasure, something to display and to show and to boast about. So it talks about this fear of this little parrot, or the parrot, of imprisonment, of being put in a cage and shown to the world instead of being given freedom. So all the time it shows this kind of fear and the escape all the time from the chasing animals. And then the story is totally narrated from the perspective of this little parrot. So he talks about his family and what he's seeing, and because it's too small and young, so some of the things are unfathomable. So he keeps going on adventures in order to understand what these humans are saying, and he doesn't understand their language. So it talks about his journeys and travels to the world of the realm of humans, and then back after he has learned about the destructive methods of the humans. The last story is an interesting one because the point of view totally shifts to a little bird. Upon its return to the nest, it finds that the children that they were playing under the tree have totally destroyed the tree. So part of their games, they've totally ruined the fruits, thrown the fruits, totally cut the branches while they were playing. It was a kind of a rowdy kind of play. And at the end of the story, the little bird could not find its nest, so the whole family escaped. But what is interesting is that it shows that children, not the adults, not human adults, the children could be destructive at times. And the beautiful thing about it is that after the children finish this whole destruction of the tree, thinking that they're playing around, the heat gets incredibly unbelievable, and they try to find some shade. But looking upon the tree, they realize that they just cut the last source of shade. And therefore, the idea that they have to run finding another source, but they fail because they have done that to other trees as well. So they have to go back home and lock themselves inside their homes. So it's a beautiful story that shows again and reminds us of the dangers of cutting of trees, and also the importance of preserving forests, because they have many unique properties and things that we need to preserve on the ecological level. Collectively, these tales, and I'm quoting Harvester and Blinkstop, direct our attention to what animals are telling us about themselves instead of relying on what humans are telling us about them. When it comes to theater, this was an interesting approach, because despite the abundance of English plays written in English, American plays or British plays, about or foregrounding animal voices, these plays I had to sort of read carefully, and I had to go through almost a Herculean task of finding texts that have been performed and that foreground animal stories. And of course, they give voice to the animals throughout the play from the very beginning till the end. And this idea of giving voice becomes a kind of a unique dramatic technique used by these children playwrights, allowing them to introduce the problem, allowing them to speak about themselves and to show what's happening and the damage and the harm that is happening to them from the humans. And what is unique about the four selected plays is that the way they're presented or acted on stage, we have sometimes adult actors, sometimes we have children actors, but sometimes we also have puppets. And that is also a very interesting thing, a blending of having different traditions blend together. And what is remarkable about the 4 plays is that they all make use of cinematic techniques, because they try to show the children what happens to the forest before and after, to the natural world before death and after its regeneration. The first, this is a list of the selected plays, and I'm going to talk about one at a time very briefly, because I don't want to exceed the time. The first one is The Monkeys of Qurdana, by Mahmoud Kahila, who's an Egyptian writer, and he's a very famous playwright for children, by the way. And Qurdana, by the way, is a derivative form of the word Qurd, which means monkey. So it could be translated into Monkeyland, the monkeys of Monkeyland. So the play is very interesting because it talks about the capturing of one little monkey and then his return to his family. So they keep asking him, how did you escape? How or why humans let you go? And he tells them, because they realized after they took me that there are laws against hunting animals. So they have done the harm, but they're bringing me back. But the interesting part starts when they start role playing. And here you will find the resonance of Animal Farm by George Orwell, which is a very famous allegory, of course. And you'll also find the resonance, and the play strongly echoes Saadallah al-Nus's play, The King is the King. The moment the monkeys begin to imitate humans, so they tell the monkey, what happened to you? Please act this to us. And he says, okay, I'm going to act. So the moment they start imitating humans is the moment they destroy their own natural world, because they appoint a king, and the king begins to be vicious, and he begins to kill the monkeys, and they starve again. So that's the interesting game of power that they play, but it shows again that the more they become humanized, the more they become savages even more, and they destroy their own world. So it's a very interesting play. It touches upon ecological issues, but it also reflects or presents, again, a political and social message as well. The second play is The Lake of Peace by Sara al-Qasimi. It's an Emirati playwright, and it was performed several times. It's about the frogs who live in this beautiful realm and lake until one rebellious frog, curious frog, decides to read the book, the prohibited book. And the moment it reads it is the moment the whole realm gets enchanted, and there's a curse that falls over the lake, and it turns black and it is destroyed. So they can't live, they can't eat, they can't drink, and they go on a journey together to try and find an enchantment or a kind of a spell that would reverse this destructive spell. So the play talks about, again, through the animals, and we can see that in kind of implicitly, that the curiosity of this rebellious frog somehow echoes this human curiosity for science and for scientific discoveries and curiosity. So the outcome is definitely destructive. But the play ends with a beautiful, optimistic note, because it shows that despite the death of nature, of the lake, there is always hope for regeneration if we change our approach towards nature and towards the natural world. The third play is Sorrows in the Forest by Mahmoud al-Atibi, who's an Iraqi playwright. This one is very interesting because it talks about fires. And throughout the search, I really could find very few fables, whether short animal stories or plays for children, that touch upon fires, and the fires that are created by humans, by the way, in order to expand in terms of, urban expansion, because they want to build their cities. So what happens is that it destroys the world of animals. However, reluctant at first to work together, the animals decide that they're going to replant the forest, that despite the fires that humans are doing, they're going to work together and they're going to rebuild the forest. They're going to plant again the forest. So it shows again the destruction that could happen. And they even talk about that what humans are doing are killing them as well. So they're not just murdering us as animals, but they're murdering the humans as well. And this is the kind of conversation that we have, the dialogue that they have throughout the play. So it talks about how there's a need to rebuild and not just to accept the damage that happens to the environment. The fourth play is The Story of a Land by Habib al-Jandoubi, who was a Tunisian writer, and it talks about pollution. Interesting, one day, animals and humans wake up to find that there is black rain that envelops the world, and they understand that it is a direct effect of climate change, and they say so in the play. But the play gradually, through the journey of the child with the animals, through the clouds until they reach the higher clouds, and they pass beyond this kind of black cloud that's enveloping the universe. They get to know about climate change effects and what's happening. They get to see how clouds form and how rain falls. And every time the child and the animals travel higher, they meet a certain cloud that tells them what humans are doing to the world and what's happening and the pollution that's happening to the world. So again, the play highlights this importance of connection between humans and the environment in order to save the world and the natural world. So collectively, these plays, they highlight the importance of nature and ecological balance, and they confirm all the time the injustice of humans and what humans are doing to nature. And they all the time, by foregrounding the voices of animals, they're questioning our actions towards the environment and what we're doing. And therefore they present ecocentric lessons and views, giving children hope all the time that despite death and destruction, there's always regeneration, there's always a way to solve the environmental crises that the world is witnessing at the moment. Thank you very much, and I hope I did not exceed the time. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I try to find my clapping hands.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay, we are slightly behind, so it's now past. So if there are crucial questions or clarifications, I would allow one now or two. If not, I would say we immediately continue with our final speaker. I already spotted Kevin in the
Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Forgive me, I'm going to keep my my video off because I'm coming to you from Morocco, where it has been a true adventure trying to find internet that is reliable and functions. So if you'll excuse me, if you can't hear, can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Christoph, did you want to do a quick,
Yeah, I wanted to do a quick introduction, but now you so now I'm a little bit puzzled because I wanted to introduce you being at the moment in Jordan.
Yeah, that's a study in and of itself, a whole different story. I'm happy to tell you, but yeah, we ended up in Morocco. Yeah, I can explain.
Okay, just let me say a few words. So I'm happy to introduce to you Kevin Blankinship, who is an associate professor of Arabic language and literature at Brigham Young University, which is in Utah, the US. But at the moment, he's not based in Jordan, but in Morocco, and maybe can tell us why. So currently he's working on a book project about the medieval Muslim freethinker Al-Maʿarrī and on Islamic animal ethics. So as I already said earlier, so with Kevin's talk and presentation, we kind of close our little journey and circle and return also to the more classic traditions of animals. So he's not only an academic and researcher, but he's also a published poet and writes essays who appear in public or popular press venues like The Atlantic, The Times Literary Supplement, Foreign Policy, and more. So I'm really happy that we, kind of virtually and now even without seeing each other, meet, because I tried to involve Kevin already a year ago in our horse fables workshop we hold with his work on Al-Maʿarrī's fables on the donkey, no, the pistol and the mule. yeah, whatsoever. So great to have you here, and looking forward what you can present us.
Thank you very much, Christoph. Yes, I apologize for the technological, flexibility. Well, I appreciate your flexibility and apologize for the technological issue. As you hear me talk, perhaps you can just pretend that you're listening to a podcast, and I'll try to do my best to make it an engaging podcast that you can listen to as you hear my voice, but you can't see me, or a PowerPoint presentation, which I fear would crash my internet and rob you all of the chance to hear about this amazing person that I'll talk about. Very briefly, why we're in Morocco instead of Jordan, we have a study abroad program at my university, and normally it goes to Jordan, but because of the conflict this year, at the last minute, the university decided to restrict travel to Jordan for different study abroad programs, and ours was one of those. Luckily, we have come to Morocco in the past, and so we're well set up here in Rabat, where I'm coming to you, and ideally, because it's on the same time zone as you all, so for me it was very convenient. Anyway, I appreciate your flexibility. Could you, Christoph, remind me of the ideal time range that you'd like me to stick to? I'm very happy to. I'm very good. Well, I care a lot about making sure I stay to the time. So you tell me what you'd like, when you'd like me to end, and I will certainly end there.
So if you could you try to not exceed 20 minutes? That would
Absolutely.
That would be ideal.
Absolutely. Yeah, I could probably even do it in 15. I asked that partly because there are a few fables that I'll read, and I didn't know whether I would need to summarize perhaps a couple of them and just read one for representation, or if it would be I'd have enough time to read all of them. I think I have enough time for all of them. They're short enough, as I'll explain. But anyway, thank you all for inviting me. As Christoph said, this has been something I've been waiting for a little while, and so I'm happy to be with you. My subject today is this strange person, this author, this thinker. He was a satirist, a moralist. He was a witty man of letters. Abu Al-Maʿarrī. I see Heidi nodding her head in recognition. He is known as a native son of Syria. So spent all but 18 months of his life 70 kilometers outside of Aleppo in a smaller town called Ma'arat al-Nu'man, and that's where his last name comes from. Al-Maʿarrī. It's a toponym. It indicates where he's from. And well, let me start with a couple of quotes by him just to kind of portray to you the kind of person that we're talking about. So he has a municipal tomb dedicated to him with a statue that used to be there. It's still there, but the head is now missing because in 2013, less than 2 years after the start of the Syrian civil war, an extremist group called Jabhat al-Nusra decapitated his statue so strong is his reputation for being an alleged Muslim heretic. And he's not the only one too. Things like this have happened to statues of another figure, Abu Nawas, who is the great wine poet and lech of the Islamic tradition. And I'd be happy to address that, but today's subject is Al-Maʿarrī. Anyway, on the municipal tomb of Al-Maʿarrī, it says something that Al-Maʿarrī himself wrote, which is, "This is my father's crime against me, which I myself have committed against none." And he's referring to the act of bringing children into this world. So for him, the act of bringing a child into this world is a crime. So fallen and sick is this world. This is the kind of personality that we're dealing with. Another, probably his most famous line of poetry is, he says this. He says, "Lighten your step, tread lightly, because when I think about it, this earth, the surface of the earth is made of nothing but all of these bodies." And what he's referring to is, through time, all of the people who have died over many generations leading up to now, and then all the people who die even in our own time. And what this represents is memento mori. This is a well-known, theme, trope from that we're maybe familiar with from European traditions. It certainly has a proud and rich tradition in the Arab Islamic tradition as well. And these are just a couple of quotes I'm giving you to portray to you the kind of person who Al-Maʿarrī was. He was waspish, argumentative. He lived a life of seclusion for most of his life. Again, he grew up in Ma'arat al-Nu'man. He was blinded at age 4 from smallpox. But despite that handicap, he made a name for himself early on as a poet and as a linguist. In fact, there's an association in classical Arab Islamic tradition between being blind and having a prodigious memory. And so he, showed a talent for memory, especially for language and other things related to it early on. And when he was, late 20s or perhaps around 30 years old, he took a trip to Baghdad. He left his home in what we might call a province and went to what at the time was a cultural and intellectual hub at the time, kind of making a sort of pilgrimage to make a name for himself as a poet. I often compare it to, if you're in the American context anyway, you'll forgive me. If you want to be an actor in America, you move yourself to Hollywood and start trying to network and make a name for yourself there. Something like this. If you want to be a journalist, you move to New York and just start working in newspapers there. So Al-Maʿarrī probably had something similar in mind, but it didn't work out for him for various reasons, and he returned home and lived a life of seclusion in his hometown for the rest of his life, 50 years, and he died at the ripe old age of 85. There are some people who speculate that this could be because he kept to a vegan diet from his early years, probably late 20s or 30 onward. But he was not he wasn't a hermit in the traditional sense of the word, because many people came to study with him and to even live in residence at his house. And he wrote letters to many people. He was considered a public intellectual. And again, he died at age 85, mourned by many, never married and never had children, which again accords with what he wrote on his own tombstone, which is that he thought it was not fair to children to bring them into this world. Al-Maʿarrī wrote many works, some 13 of which survive today. And I'll name a few, and I'll focus on the ones that have to do with animals, because he wrote, I'll say, obsessively about animals. He uses them as literary symbols. He uses them as moral exemplars. He often lets them speak, as is obvious from certain works, notably this work that Christoph mentioned, the Epistle of the Horse and the Mule. There's another work which he's probably best known for in the West, which is the Epistle of Forgiveness, Risalat al-Ghufran. This is a journey through heaven and hell in which an aging grammarian, whom Al-Maʿarrī is responding to in sort of a satiric tone, travels and meets different poets and discusses issues of poetry and grammar and religion and heresy and other things like this. His best known work in the Arab world is a collection of poetry called Self-Imposed Necessity, Luzum ma la yalzam. And this refers to using double end rhyme, where instead of having one consonant rhyme at the end of the Arabic, you have two. And so it's like, we might call it rich rhyme. So it imposes a linguistic restriction and makes writing the poetry much harder. It also makes it very striking to listen to, although, as you can probably tell from a constraint like this, it's a more bookish kind of poetry. This isn't oral poetry as much as some of the early pre-Islamic poems or kind of sung poetry, strophic poetry that you might find in some place like medieval Iberia. So anyway, he often uses animals as symbols, especially comparing them favorably to humans. And I might give an example of that later. The last work I'll mention is an exchange of letters that he wrote at the very end of his life. In fact, he died before he was able to complete this exchange, with another intellectual. This intellectual was Mu'ayyid Fiddin Ash-Shirazi, who was a poet in his own right, but more specifically a missionary for the Fatimid Shiite dynasty. So different denomination than Al-Maʿarrī. In fact, Al-Maʿarrī makes fun of Shiite Muslims in a lot of his works. And they have an exchange of letters about Al-Maʿarrī's veganism. And this is probably the closest thing that we have to a treatise by Al-Maʿarrī about this subject. Al-Maʿarrī often wrote in a way that it was hard to pin him down about his opinions, especially when it came to controversial subjects on religion. He said a lot of controversial things in his poetry, but he finds a way to wriggle out of sort of a less generous interpretation of those things. At any rate, these are some of the works that kind of portray, who he was, his interests, and especially how he related to animals. What I want to talk about today with the rest of my time is a series of very short animal fables, if we can call them fables, and I'll talk about why I question that here in a second, that survive not as a work in their own right, but as fragments in another work. So that other work was written in the 11th century in medieval Muslim Iberia by a vizier, a government official named Abdul Ghafoor al-Kalā'i. And the work is called Ihkam Sanat al-Kalam. So mastering the art of prose, mastering the craft of prose, something like that. Al-Kalā'i was a chancery official, a scribe, working for the government. And this was sort of a more general type of writing, genre of writing, a handbook for people who held that kind of position, and talks about proper, good style for a chancery scribe official. And so often in these works, what you get is quotations from what are considered exemplary works of prose writing. And within this work, Al-Kalā'i cites, he's obsessed with Al-Maʿarrī. He loves him. he cites a lot of his works. And so one of the things that he cites are these short animal fables that he writes, because for Al-Maʿarrī, they're remarkably clear. Al-Maʿarrī was very fond of, again, as you can tell from my description of this poetry collection that he had, stylistic difficulty, using rich rhyme, for example, using obscure words. And in the context of prose, he would write in what's called saj'a in Arabic, or rhyming prose. So, every so often you have, not every single word rhymes, but you'll have a clause, a short clause, and then the word at the end of that clause will rhyme with the word at the end of the following clause, separated by a comma. Although you don't need a comma, because if you can follow the rhyme, you can tell where each clause ends and the next begins. Anyway, Al-Maʿarrī often writes like this, and it is very difficult to read. However, these short animal fables are not written like this, and so perhaps Al-Kalā'i, the author of this chancery manual, thought these were exemplary for this reason. But I think he also, might have seen some humor in them, which I'll speculate on, because they teach us, a couple of things about Al-Maʿarrī. First of all, his concern for animals. Second, his overarching agenda, which whenever he talks about animals or whenever he talks about anything else, he has in mind something called zuhd in the Islamic tradition, which is often translated as asceticism, but could also be more generally translated as piety. Piety in the sense of renouncing the things of this world. And so for a lot of people, zuhd, ends up being kind of an exaggerated lifestyle of you're denying yourself basically any human comfort. You're only eating a very strict diet. Supposedly Al-Maʿarrī only wore a coarse wool, like a hair shirt. We talk about a hair shirt prophet or a wool shirt prophet or something like that. Al-Maʿarrī supposedly dressed like this, only slept on his prayer mat, lived an austere lifestyle. That's kind of the association with zuhd, but it's a general outlook on life. And this pervades Al-Maʿarrī's writings, including these short animal fables. And this is why I hesitate to call them fables, because they have a different message than, for example, the tales of Kalīla and Dimna, which Heidi mentioned, and might have come up elsewhere. There is a moral lesson, but it's the same moral lesson throughout. In Kalīla and Dimna, there are different reasons for telling the stories. The king asks his vizier or his sage, tell me a story on this topic, or tell me a story where the moral lesson is this. and then the sage will tell a story related to that. But all of Al-Maʿarrī's tales, as we'll see in a second, all have kind of the same message. So with that in mind, there are 3 of these short fables by Al-Maʿarrī that survive. And they all, again, have sort of a similar message. They come from this lost work. Again, they're anthologized in this Chancery scribe manual. They're all from a lost work called Kitab al-Qa'if, which means the book of the tracker. A tracker meaning someone who can find animals in the wilderness. And there's sort of a mystical quality, a magical quality to descriptions that I've read from other works of the Qa'if. So there's another work by an earlier author, earlier than Al-Maʿarrī, called Ibn Qutaybah. He was a famous anthologist and literateur in the 8th and 9th century. And he has a book called The Excellence of the Arabs. And in that, he describes what a Qa'if can do. And it includes things like a Qa'if can hear the sound of ant feet as they tread on a stone. Or the Qa'if can perform geomancy, darb al-ramal, and through that can tell where animals are. So it's more than just, I'm a good tracker. I can hunt animals. There's sort of this otherworldly quality to it, but that's an aside for another day, something I'm still trying to understand in relation to this. So in this lost work, again, partly surviving in this Chancery scribe manual from, a century or 2 later, in a very different place in the Arab world, Al-Maʿarrī's works survive and even thrived under the interest of this vizier and scribe, Al-Kalīla. So to the fables themselves, there are 3 that survive. One about an ant, one about a bird. It's a kinglet, which is part of the genre of passerine birds, so sparrows and other things like that, small birds. And then a lion. If you'll indulge me, I'll read each of the 3. They're very short. They're sort of ultra short, which marks them out among other animal fables, which can go on depending on the work. So regarding the ant, okay, I'll read them first, and then I'll wrap up by kind of bringing in the framing that's around them. There's sort of a brief framing around all 3 of these, sort of gets to the point of what Al-Maʿarrī might be trying to do. The first fable says, an ant was nearing its death. So all the other ants gathered around it. They said mournfully, God have mercy on you. Is there any grain of barley that's been dragged, or a grain of wheat on which the rain has fallen, or the remains of a tablecloth that was spread? The connotation is there anything that you've stored up that can help you in this moment of your death? Is there any food, any provision that can help you here? The ant says, be not troubled. I've stored up with God that which anyone who stores its like will merit God's mercy, namely that I never shed blood at all. So we have a pacifist ant who has refused his whole life to shed blood, which raises a question because, presumably ants can't shed blood in the same way that, a predator or carnivore might shed blood. So, does the ant truly merit paradise by avoiding harm to other creatures in the same way that other creatures might? Anyway, that's where the sort of humor of this might come in, but it could be serious anyway to get across this the message that Al-Maʿarrī wants to get across. Episode 2 involves this small bird, a kinglet, wasa, like a sparrow chick or a sparrow-like bird, something like that. So some claimed that a kinglet lived next to a spotted serpent, a dappled serpent. Whenever the kinglet hatched its chicks, year after year, the serpent would set out by night and devour them in the dark. Now, God rewards both injustice and kindness. A little bit of foreshadowing here about what's about to happen. And so it was that the snake in its old age went blind being confined to its den and frightening no one, neither those far away from it, nor those near to it. That's a bit of rhetorical flourish in the Arabic. It's called merism in classical rhetoric, meaning you take two opposites and state them both together to mean all or none. So neither those who live far away nor those who live nearby is like just saying anyone. He didn't frighten anyone. The kinglet's friends said, "Will you not come out to the oppressor to show how much you delight in its suffering?" So now the kinglet has a choice. It can come out and gloat. And the word in Arabic for gloating is often translated like using a modern term, modern since the 20th century anyway, which is schadenfreude. The word in Arabic is shamat or shamata, which means taking pleasure or joy in someone else's suffering, which again is like, for the modern term, it's schadenfreude. So this kinglet has a chance to gloat and to indulge in schadenfreude. The kinglet makes a different choice and says, "If I could manage to do some harm with the snake looking on, then I would soon set out. But since God's decrees hold me back, therefore my eye forbears from showing the snake," meaning showing the snake my schadenfreude, my joy in its suffering. Here is a pious kinglet. Here is a kinglet who refuses, despite its, the temptation to show the snake how much it enjoys its suffering, to go out and show that joy to the snake. And in this sense, it reads as a counter to the tale of the crow and the snake in Kalīla and Dimna, in which the crow, helped by a cunning jackal, has its revenge on the snake who has eaten its chicks. Episode 3, and the final episode of Al-Maʿarrī's tales, involve a lion who went blind. Interesting that 2 of the 3 stories involve a blind animal. Al-Maʿarrī, among other things, was obsessed with his own status as a blind person. And in, for example, the longer work, the Epistle of the Horse and the Mule, the main character, the mule, is blind and chained to a water wheel. So it is both physically unable to see and physically unable to move. And a lot of people have seen in that a parallel with Al-Maʿarrī himself, who was physically blind and also confined himself to his house, and so unable to move. A lion went blind, causing it great harm. Someone said to it, "If you go to the king of the lions and ask him to grant you bounty, it will be the best move for you. It'll be the best thing for you to do." So the lion went to the king and told him this story. The king ordered his treasurer to give him a whole limb out of the treasury every day. There's a nice pun in Arabic here. The word for whole limb is udu mu'arrab, which means like a cut off or kind of like sliced off limb for the lion to eat. But it's also a euphemism for bounty or, a portion of money, something like that. The lion who sought the prey said, "God prosper the king. I used to hunt whole goats and domestic cattle, and even then I would barely get full. Where will this meager limb sit with me?" In other words, I used to not even get full eating a whole goat or a whole cow. How can I just subsist on this one limb? The king says, "Whoever relies on another man's gains must be content with but a small bit of that man's charity." The blind lion said, "The king has spoken the truth. I don't need this limb." The king said, "Then what will you do?" The lion answered, "I will content myself with the grasses that grow after rain, and will need neither the king nor any companions." So this last tale involves a vegan lion. This isn't the only vegan lion in classical Arabic literature. There is a vegan lioness in Kalīla and Dimna, in the tale of the horseman, the lioness, and the jackal, sometimes called the lioness and the archer hunter. A lioness goes hunting and returns home to find the skinned bodies of her cubs. Terrible situation. A hunter came by, killed them, and skinned them. She laments, but then a jackal points out that the lioness herself has caused such lamentations for the parents of many animals that she has killed, being a hunter and a carnivore. So the lioness stops eating meat and only eats fruit. Then this causes a new problem, which is other animals, including the jackal, live on fruit. And so the jackal points out how the fruit supply has been dwindling because this lion only eats fruit now. So the lioness stops eating fruit and only eats grass. This is, again, not written by Al-Maʿarrī, but I think you would have appreciated the sentiment. What's going on in these tales? Again, Al-Maʿarrī writes in a way that is very clear, assuming these are Al-Maʿarrī's, assuming they're accredited properly to him. So this could be akin to his exchange of letters with this poet, Al-Mu'ayyad Fiddin Ash-Shirazi, poet and missionary in Cairo, saying, you know, these are I'm trying to get a message across, and I want that message to be clear. Perhaps Al-Kalīla, the anthologist who included them in the Chancery Scribe Manual, likes the rhymes and the artifice, or possibly what he perceives as sarcasm evident in the fables. But above all, Al-Maʿarrī was a confirmed vegan from conviction, not being forced by his blindness or poverty. These are not just so stories, the kind that we might get in Kalīla and Dimna, or that might explain this is why tigers have their stripes, this is why mosquitoes buzz in people's ears, that kind of thing. They're trying to get across a specific message. These are the moral tales of a vegan and a pacifist. And as far as I can tell, Al-Maʿarrī's reason for being a vegan, this will be my closing point, was not to, a lot of vegans, you know, voluntary vegans in history do it for advantages that redound to the human. So, for example, Pythagoras supposedly refrained from eating meat because of a belief in transmigration of souls. He believed that there could be a human soul, or what was once a human soul, existing in an animal, and if you kill that animal, you're actually killing a human. Another thinker from the Arab Islamic tradition, Al-Ghazali, has a work within a longer work. The longer work is The Revival of the Religious Sciences, Ihya Ulum ad-Din, and the smaller section is called Breaking the Two Desires, Kasr al-Shahwatain, referring to the desire for sex and the desire for meat. And what he says basically is that it is immoral. It degrades your morality as a person to eat meat. These are not the primary reasons Al-Maʿarrī gives for avoiding animal products. He says pretty clearly in this exchange of letters, which I don't have time to get into, that the reason we should avoid harm to animals, or the reason we should avoid eating meat and using animal products, is because it's harmful to animals. And in this sense, he fits into this larger discussion that we're having about the Anthropocene, about the environment, about the awareness that people have of their relationship with their environment, all the way from back in the mid-11th century, in a context where eating meat was not only permitted, but in fact encouraged and licit by Islamic law. So for that reason, he's an interesting voice to listen to and worthy of attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kevin, for this introduction of this indeed extremely fascinating person. So, unfortunately, we run out for our of time, so there's not much left for my envisioned comparative perspective final discussion. So, what we will have for sure is, I think, one quick round of direct questions to the speakers, if there are any. So if not, I will take the chance to at least ask one question for Heidi. At some point, you mentioned that these ecological animal stories have this educative purpose of creating or this eco citizen as one part of the whole ecocritical tradition. So I was wondering how much this discourse on creating these eco-citizens is popular or circulating within the region and at the moment. And connected to this, in the style of your slides, you always presented one case and then connected it to an ecocritical reading standard text, I suppose. And I was wondering if there is an ecocritical scholarship from within the region, which is growing and trying to take up issues, and not only relying on the Western traditions.
Well, to answer the first question is that these stories, again, not all of them, and I'm talking about only those that I just mentioned and others that for the sake of time I couldn't touch upon, which have this kind of backbone of ecological themes or environmental themes. Yes, because when you take a look at what they're presenting towards children, what they're telling them about the environment, and the range of topics, because some of them, as I said, they deal with hunting animals, others have to deal with even destruction for the sake of fun or enjoyment. When you take a look at the range of themes and the range of different topics that these fables deal with, you will understand that, yes, the aim at the end is to create this kind of awareness to make children act as eco-citizens. The thing that is really, that I'm wondering about, and I've always wondered about, is that these stories at the end of the day are not a lot. They're very few. So this shows that in order for this kind of thinking to grow, in order to create this kind of awareness among children, there's a need for these stories to grow, to evolve, and to become even more. So the two book series that I talked about, which really helped a lot of children, generations of children, like even myself, growing up and understanding that there is an ecological dimension to these stories, for some reason, they stopped. They're not really published as much as we would like to see them. So at one point, if you really want to have this kind of an ecocentric kind of teachings or lessons for children, you need to increase the number of fables. You need to publish more. So when it comes to publication and publication issues at the moment in the Arab world and in Egypt, and I'm talking about Egypt as a case, it's very hard to even publish my work at the moment. So because children's literature and this kind of publication or story writing is currently facing a lot of problems. So if you really want to increase this kind of environmental awareness, you need to increase the number of fables and stories. And that's the real challenge, because you want to have children understand the role towards the environment and become eco-citizens, but you need to give them what helps them truly to become so. And not just to give them at school, but to give them something to read at whenever they're reading during leisure or whatever. So this is the kind of dilemma that you'll find at the moment. When it comes to ecocritical scholarship, yes, ecocriticism as a field is growing now in Egypt, in the Arab world. And despite the fact that, let's say 5 or 6 years ago, ecocriticism was not really that popular in Egypt and its scholarly works, and I'm talking about Egypt in particular, but now it's growing. Because you can see a lot of approaches, ecocritical approaches, and I've seen one study, by the way, on this, to Kalīla and Dimna. You can see other ecocritical approaches to works for children in general, to even more modern novels for adults, directed towards adults. So as a scholarly approach, ecocriticism is definitely growing, but it needs to grow even more when it comes to children's literature, because it's still in its very early steps, especially when it comes to studies conducted on Arabic literature, particularly. You will find this a lot when it comes to Western literature, but on Arabic literature, this is a real challenge because there's still few. The studies are still few.
Okay, thank you. Chris?
Yeah, thanks to all the speakers. It was a really fascinating session. I sort of had a very general question that I think applies to them all. It was even, I think, in Beatrice's talk. It's really the question of how do you read the anthropomorphization of animals? So, that seems to be a theme across all 3 talks. And in the sense of, what I mean, it's different in each case, but what for your author, are they writing about real animals? Are they, how much are they anthropomorphizing, on a sliding scale between the real presentation of the animal and anthropomorphic presentation? I'm just kind of curious about how each of the speakers read the role of anthropomorphization in their sort of authors and what purpose it's serving. Because it seems to serve my guess is it's serving actually quite critical function of sort of promoting an ecological perspective, critiquing anthropocentrism. So I'm just curious about how each speaker sort of sees the presentation of animals in their authors, if that makes sense.
So, who wants to respond?
First, oh, go ahead.
Yeah. Kevin, you're on.
Yeah, Al-Maʻarrī, compared to other, and what I tried to do at the end is to compare his treatment of animals with sort of other examples, and to the extent that he focuses on animals per se as creatures in their own right, he's very much a zoomorphizing author. However, as you point out, he does it in a way that is very anthropomorphizing. So, it wouldn't be a stretch to say in these three tales that I mentioned, he is turning animals not just into any person, but to himself. Someone who is vegan, someone who is blind, someone who is very concerned with, rejecting the things of this world. So, he's anthropomorphizing in the service of trying to be zoomorphizing. Again, there are many examples of other authors within the Islamic tradition, within the European tradition, within the classical Greek and Roman tradition, who focus more on sort of the benefits of avoiding these products that redound to humans. And for Al-Maʻarrī, again, the main thing he talks about across his writings is that we want to avoid harm to animals, and that's the main reason. So in that sense, he is zoomorphizing, I guess. He's focused on the animal itself.
If I may, as for Giacomo Leopardi, I think is anthropomorphizing very much, but I think that is trying to put himself like midway between a poor anthropomorphizing of animals and the understanding of animals as real animals. It was offered a position of professor of natural history actually at the beginning, right in the first 10 years of the 19th century. It was between 1810, 1811, in the sense that he was very familiar with the evolutionary theory, for instance, proto-evolutionary theory, of course, the Lamarckian theory. So he had this kind of inclination towards sciences. So in my understanding, he had this idea of animals as real animals, so, I mean, from a scientific point of view. But in these cases, specifically in this case, is trying to put himself, like to position himself midway, in the sense that he wants to give you this kind of estrangement, this feeling of estrangement, in the sense that you can recognize yourself into those animals because they are anthropomorphized animals, but not completely. So this kind of unendlich, and it's absolutely a rhetorical device, which is the rhetorical device of an intellectual from the 19th century. So with all these Eurocentric positioning, which we have already discussed. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Heidi, there's no need to also.
No, I was just going to say that it is there in varying degrees. It depends on the story or the play itself. So for instance, in the plays of Qardana, you will find it very much evident, but it's for the sake of criticism. So it's there, it's strongly present, because the more these animals become human-like, the more they degenerate. So it depends on the story itself. And of course, the purpose is different in each of these stories, but not all of them. I mean, it's very hard to put a range, because some of them, it's like 2 out of 10. Others, like the plays of Qardana, would be 10 out of 10 if you take a look at what's happening in the play itself. So I think it depends on the ecological message that it's presenting through each of these works.
No, thank you.
Oh, I think it's time to leave you to your lunch break, and to have at least a small break before the next panel session starts. So many thanks again for Kaori organizing the whole Rethinking Fables project, and always setting up these amazing panels and workshops for more than a year now. And also, of course, many thanks to our 3 panelists. I think we have to think about possibilities and ways to stay connected and continue this conversation. I really enjoyed this session, and yeah, wish you all a pleasant weekend, and or of course see you soon for the for the final session. Of course, I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah.
Thank you so
Thank
much. Thank you.
Thank you.